The 2000 U.S. presidential election is pretty well known for being one of the closest elections in U.S. history, with George W. Bush winning Florida by just 500 votes, and therefore the election despite Gore winning the overall popular vote. But what if, in an alternate timeline, Al Gore had been able to win Florida in the 2000 U.S. presidential election? But first, there'd have to be a few conditions changed in Gore's campaign in order to win Florida. Campaign changes to make for Al Gore would first be to tone down his somewhat populist rhetoric. This is because his people versus the power statements were kind of contradictory to himself since Clinton was the incumbent president and therefore Gore was the incumbent vice president. Additionally, the public was not able to easily forget the Clinton campaign fundraising controversy at the Lay Temple in the 1996 presidential election where China funded Clinton. Also, the Gore campaign's attack on Bush for having been drunk driving in 1976 was quite petty given that it was 2000 and Clinton had previously smoked marijuana. Furthermore, Al Gore's performance in all of the 2000 debates could have been a lot better. Another possible condition for the Gore campaign might be a vice presidential change. While Joe Lieberman had a large appeal for being a moderate and a bit of a conservative Democrat on issues, some critics attribute Gore's loss to Ralph Nader and the Green Party, who garnered 2.7% of the popular vote. So someone who could help mediate these voters is John 3 Purple Hearts Kerry. However, Kerry was from the liberal wing of the Democrat Party and would be attacked more by Republicans as opposed to Lieberman. Then there's Bob Graham, who was one of Florida's most popular politicians, but it's hard to say how he would impact the ticket in the rest of the country as Lieberman had a broad appeal, so there's lots of ups and downs here for Gore's campaign. But what really matters is if this VP can defeat Cheney in a debate and Lieberman did well enough to get a tie. Anything less might cause less support for the Gore campaign. So regardless of whether or not a vice presidential change is needed, Florida goes blue and Al Gore has now won the 2000 U.S. presidential election. On the initial domestic front, Gore is going to use the budget surplus to create his Social Security lockbox and expand healthcare coverage. No Child Left Behind also passes, and taxes are going to remain where they are under Clinton. Anyway, on to more interesting things. So with the war on terror, the 9/11 terror attack still happens just as they did in our timeline, and the invasion of Afghanistan will also go as it had. The key difference, I believe, is just going to be the mission of nation building. You see, the Bush administration primarily focused and followed on the neoconservative factions of the party, where one major aspect was nation building and spreading democracy, which isn't something the Gore administration has attached to it. That being said, the U.S. under Gore is probably gonna stay in Afghanistan for a while. Moving on to the question of Iraq. Now this is something that most people tend to go with the idea that Al Gore never would have invaded Iraq because he said he was against it after the invasion and the mismanagement of the early years of the Iraq War. But I would question how much of that is due to hindsight bias given the fact that in 2002 Congress gave the authority of the president to invade Iraq, and during the transition from Clinton to Bush, the outgoing president recommended toppling Saddam. I also feel like Gore would invade Iraq in late 2003 or early 2004 due to the general hysteria of terrorism and the perceived lack of progress in Afghanistan after 2002. And then there's the whole WMD's mismanagement of intelligence issues. Furthermore, Gore's vice president, be it Lieberman or Kerry, supports the invasion of Iraq. Lieberman was a strong supporter of the Iraq War and was a war on terror hawk, so there's likely even more encouragement for the war if Lieberman was Gore's vice president. Additionally, John Kerry supported the war before famously flip-flopping his stance with hindsight bias when he was competing for the 2004 Democratic nomination. However, Bob Graham was strongly against the invasion, even in 2002, as he felt it would distract U.S. forces from their existing mission in Afghanistan. So if Gore had chosen Graham as the vice president, then it would be an obstacle to the Iraq War. However, I don't think it would change the fact that the invasion is still going to happen. President Gore maintains much of the Clinton administration's DoD personnel, so he likely would be more willing to listen to General Shinseki's assessment that the U.S. would need a lot more troops to occupy the country. Furthermore, Gore was a Vietnam vet and would definitely do the opposite of what had happened in our timeline with Donald Rumsfeld's light military footprint in Iraq, which drew out the insurgency. Regardless, the initial invasion goes well and Saddam's regime is easily defeated. The first major change will be that there are no CPA orders, which in our timeline saw CPA orders 1 and 2 dissolve the Iraqi army without even disarming them and fire everyone from their jobs who were part of the Ba'athist Party. You see, in our timeline, these were passed by Paul Bremer, who was an utter moron and didn't understand how anything worked in Iraq and clearly also didn't possess a working brain. Everyone in Iraq had to register with the Ba'ath Party in order to have a job, so he put everyone on the unemployment list, and also took the paychecks of everyone in the military who still had their weapons. You see the issue here. Now that's something that Gore wouldn't have done. Now on to the insurgency phase. Now there's still going to be the Shia-Sunni mass sectarian divide amongst the Iraqi population, which had primarily occurred in the 90s, due to, of course, the Clinton sanctions on the country. Now it's hard to say how much worse the sectarianism is in Iraq, especially after an additional year of sanctions, with the invasion taking place later. But with more boots on the ground to occupy Iraq, as well as no CPA orders, the initial insurgency will not be near as bad as it was in our timeline, at least for the time being. The 2004 Republican primaries sees John McCain as the frontrunner, primarily due to his hawkish platform in the War on Terror, which is well in the American mainstream, as despite the Gore administration's relatively well handling of the conflict, things can always be going a lot better, and McCain is the candidate to do that in the eyes of the public. The primary also sees Ron Paul run for the nomination as a libertarian conservative candidate who is a dove on foreign policy. Paul will notably soak up the many anti-war voters, and his candidacy kicks off a potentially earlier Tea Party movement against Gore's taxes. However, Paul is barely even a challenge to McCain. The next contender for the nomination, who is also barely even noteworthy, would likely be Newt Gingrich, who was a former Republican Speaker of the House during the Clinton administration, and he politicized literally everything in the 90s. Yeah, he'll basically be only getting votes from people who believe that Gore is a continuation of Clinton, and who have continued to follow the partisan mindset of everything is bad due to the opposite party. Most notably, though, George W. Bush isn't running for the Republican nomination, despite his razor-thin loss against Gore in 2000. This is because Bush was a pretty smart guy and knew when to run for the presidency. His plans in our timeline were always to run again if he had lost the 2000 election. However, he planned on running at the opportune time, and 2004 really wasn't the time for Republicans, as Gore is leading the country in the War on Terror, so Bush is currently biding his time for now. The 2004 election sees the incumbent Al Gore go up against challenger John McCain, who will choose someone like Jeb Bush as his running mate. The campaign sees McCain attack the Gore administration on foreign policy, which is a winning issue for him, although Gore will be able to point out his successful responses to 9/11 in Afghanistan. However, Gore is doing very well on the domestic front on just about every issue except for taxes. I feel like there's a slight chance at a McCain victory, but I do believe that it would be a Gore sweep of the Electoral College. However, just like with the Bush administration's second term in our timeline, this is where things will go south for Gore. Hurricane Katrina and the Great Recession will both still hit like in our timeline, and there's very little the Gore administration can do compared to the Bush administration on these issues, as the housing bubble was going to pop anyway, due to the way it had been set up under the Clinton administration. Additionally, Iraq is going to heat up, partially due to the Iranians. But first, I want to mention the color revolutions, which had occurred in our timeline, where democratization efforts had been successful in many post-communist countries, which had been in a fragile transitional period between authoritarianism and democracy, and had been supported by the Bush administration to witness a period of stability. Under Gore, however, these revolution attempts would still occur. However, it's hard to say how much the Gore administration would support them in their fragile transitional periods. And if he didn't handle it in the same way Bush had, then these post-communist states could witness some very violent political conflict, democratic backsliding, and even civil wars. Additionally, the 2004 NATO enlargement is still going to happen like in our timeline, and Putin will cry and put Russia down their revisionist path. And again, depending on how the color revolutions go, under Gore, those countries might witness more Russian intervention to maintain puppet regimes, roll back democratization with mass backsliding in states that see pro-Russian governments end up in power. And if civil wars or violent insurgencies broke out, that would spell opportunity for Putin in states that in our timeline would end up aligning with the West and become democracies. Iraq during Gore's second term will start to heat up, like I said. Now it's almost impossible to determine what all factors are changed due to potentially having a larger occupation force and no CPA orders. But for sure, violence during the early insurgency phase will be less than our timeline, with more occupation forces in those early months. But the administration would also likely make the mistake of withdrawing many troops before areas are properly cleared and held. Additionally, sectarianism will still be a big problem, and I believe the 2006 Al-Askari mosque bombing still occurs and civil war in the country kicks off. An aspect that I want to mention about the Iraq War here is Iranian influence and exportation of violence with their proxies. You see, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps trained many Shia militia groups as proxies to escalate violence against US and coalition forces, which of course made things a lot worse in Iraq. Now, in our timeline, President Bush would give soft units permission to engage the IRGC in Iraq, and that would go pretty well, and I personally don't see Gore doing the same thing. Put simply, Bush would execute the 2007 to 2008 time in the Iraq War perfectly to stabilize things and prevent a massive disaster. And although Gore definitely wouldn't be making the same decisions, the conditions would have been pretty different from 2004 to 2006. And there's no telling how much damage Iran is going to fully do now with a free hand. The real question becomes, will President Gore enact the troop surge that Bush had done in our timeline? And to that I say it could go either way. On the one hand, he's the incumbent president who now doesn't really have to worry about the next election and would likely be told that a surge is the right thing to do. On the other hand, this is the most violent that this timeline has ever seen Iraq, and for sure there would be many members of Congress who would strongly oppose sending more US troops back. Furthermore, Gore's primary supporters for the surge in the Senate would be John McCain and Lindsey Graham, which has its obvious difficulties. Back to Russia. On the 2008 Georgian War, things will be pretty much the same as in our timeline. However, the difference will be that Gore is the incumbent president, and his response might change depending on how much Russia gained from crushing more of the color revolutions, and how much bolder this revisionist Russia has become from doing so. Anyway, the Georgia War has the potential to become a larger talking point in the 2008 election if Russia is bolder and how much more they're going to go into Georgia. Speaking of which, on to the next election. Starting with the incumbent party, the Democratic primaries, will see Vice President Lieberman seen as initial frontrunner. However, Lieberman's stance on the war on terror are falling outside of the liberal mainstream, and his ties to the increasingly unpopular Gore administration will not help him out much, as the US is knee-deep in the recession, and Lieberman has the misfortune of being the incumbent VP. Next is Secretary of State John Kerry, who draws significant support for his ability to face all of the foreign policy issues facing the US. He also has a pretty liberal stance on how to fix the economy, but despite his previous time in the Senate, voters see him more as a foreign policy guy, as that's been his job for the past 8 years, and would trust other people more so on the economy and domestic issues. And then there's Barack Obama, a youthful, fresh face to the political scene with a very liberal set of solutions. He draws much support and is able to easily fend off Hillary Clinton early in the campaign trail when she accuses him of being from Kenya. However, his lack of experience is where he falters against Kerry as the two battle it out for the nomination. Obama leads the liberal wing of the party while Kerry attempts to gain their support, yet he appeals more to moderates. As for the Republicans, this is where George W. Bush re-enters the political scene. Remember, he was viewed as the new Reagan in 2000, and in this alternate timeline, Bush's return to running for the presidency will spark massive hope for Republicans. His platform is to solve the recession by ending a lot of government spending, privatizing elements of Social Security, and lowering taxes. On the world stage, Bush is of course hawkish on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan, and wants to challenge Russian revisionism. I feel like he would also sweep the nomination and knock Romney, Huckabee, and Paul out of the water. The 2012 election definitely witnesses a landslide victory for Bush, regardless of him going against Obama or Kerry. This also means that Hillary will likely win the 2012 Democrat nomination, but regardless, Bush will defeat her. For one, Hillary is far from being a clean candidate, and two, because his first term will go relatively well, as you will see. Starting with Iraq, Bush will oversee an increase in American forces from 2009 until the withdrawal in 2011. However, coalition forces will conduct a lengthy pursuit of the AQI remnants and defeat what would become ISIS. This is because, unlike the Obama administration, this alternate Bush presidency will keep sufficient coalition forces in country until the withdrawal is ensuring that the insurgency doesn't spark back up again. Furthermore, Bush will allow for U.S. forces to pursue Iranians in Iraq who are trying to instigate more violence. On the economy, Bush will push for partial privatization of Social Security into what is called a Thrift Saving Plan, or TSP. You see, basically a TSP has your money invested which grows over time, and the more money that goes in, the more money you'll earn by the time you take it out. We have them in the army and it's pretty good, and Bush's plan was to enact this for the entire country, and maybe he might get it done in this alternate time in office and, not make Social Security suck so bad. On Russia, Bush supports any democratization efforts in countries which are run by Russian puppet governments, which sees the US and Russia have heightened geopolitical tensions. So this means that in events like the Syrian civil war and whenever Russian PMCs are active in Africa, there will be a larger emphasis on ideas of Russo-American proxy wars. Additionally, things in Ukraine will also see a stronger US opposition to Russian annexations of Crimea, as well as the Donbass War in 2014. However, there's no telling how this would end up working out. The killing of bin Laden also occurs under Bush's first term, just like in Obama's first term. However, the mission in Afghanistan would likely continue and shift towards nation building as well as fighting the Taliban as well. Again, not much is changing in Afghanistan in my view in this alternate timeline. The 2011 Arab Spring will still occur, but now that Bush is in charge, the US will provide more support for democratization movements and will apply pressure on more authoritarian states and regimes. I believe that Syria still ends up in a state of civil war, but now with more American intervention to fight against the Russians. However, there's no telling how this different Arab Spring will go compared to an hour timeline now that Bush is here and sending support. I feel like that is about all that I can accurately predict, with Bush winning a comfortable 2012 election with a lot of changed conditions and factors that sees a very different world compared to an hour timeline. And of course, the only logical successor to George W. Bush is of course his brother, the great Jeb. But that is of course just one possible scenario for if Al Gore had won the 2000 US presidential election. What do you think would have happened? Write in the comments. And this has also been the first time I've redone an old video, so let me know if you want to see any other of my older videos updated and reloaded.